Yes. Okay, welcome everybody. This is the third part of a discussion on cooperative security. And I'm very happy to have Steven Erlanger with us. He's the diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times. He has been in many countries in Europe, Paris, London, Prague, Berlin, also in wider Europe, meaning Moscow, but also in Asia and in the Middle East. Thank you, Steven, for being with us. We'll have a talk about 45 minutes on the state of security in Europe and the idea of cooperative security, which was engraved in the OSCE, or at the time the KSCE, the Conference for Security in Europe and Cooperation in Europe, 30 years ago in Paris. And that seems to be kind of gone. The first two talks we had was with activists, and the second one with politicians. And now we have the critical view of a journalist who has seen, I would say, I'm not exaggerating, almost everything, ups and downs. And I would say now we're more on the downside. And he is in Brussels, just having reported on the discussions on the budget. In the background, you see Willy Brandt, who has done some courageous stuff years ago. There will be no repetition of this at all. We have new challenges. We have turbulent times in Europe. Cooperative security is in turmoil. The organization which was built and created for that, the OSCE, is in a crisis right now. The Secretary General is gone, and all the other three who are heading the organization. And this is the platform for cooperative security. Europe, the EU, seems to be in between China, Russia, and somehow also between the US. Not completely, because of course we have transatlantic, very excellent ties transatlantic-wise, but still, the current administration looks a little bit different on that. And therefore, I would like also to point out that the Ebert Foundation, my name is Reinhard Krumm, I'm the head of the office in Vienna on cooperative security and peace. We have done an initiative, the Cooperative Security Initiative, and you can find it on the World Wide Web. Steven, the first question is a little bit provocative, because we asked the same thing to the activists and also to the politicians. Do you see a war coming up in Europe, or is that extremely far-fetched? I'm asking this because the activists were saying, we're not excluding this, and the politicians were saying, well, we're trying everything, this is not happening. What do you think? Is this far-fetched?
Well, Reinhard, first of all, thank you, and it's an honor to do this. It's great to see you again and to be part of this program. I'm not a prophet, thank God. Most prophets are false, as we've learned. I don't see a war coming. I think, there is significant deterrence. I certainly don't see a major struggle, let's say, in the old-fashioned sense, a Russia-US war, no. But when you look at Ukraine, there is a war already going on in Europe. And more than, I think, 13,000 people have died in that war. And it's not often spoken about or covered, but it is an active war in what I consider Europe. You can call it a borderland of some kind, but it's real. You have a Turkey that is much more aggressive, that is reaching out in the Eastern Mediterranean, that is flexing its muscles in Libya, in Syria. It has 10,000 troops in Syria. Now, maybe that's a good thing, but a Turkey that's also toying with Moscow, having bought and deployed Russian anti-missile systems, the S-400s, even though it's a NATO ally. And, there's always the possibility of internal strife, protests, and so on. But, if war means anything like Bosnia again or Kosovo again, If you put Ukraine to the side, I just don't see it, to be honest.
That's good. I was also slightly surprised that war was not excluded. And then the question is, well, how do you define war? Is it a small one? Is it what we see in parts of Europe? And I agree, Ukraine, of course, is part of Europe. If you talk about cooperative security, among experts, they smile at you and say, come on, cooperative security is over, it's of the past. We had it in the 90s, we're hoping for getting in the 90s and so on. Do you think cooperative security in the current international system is really over, or are we exaggerating that?
I think, well, I don't know if we includes you, but I think that is an exaggeration. You know, what is deterrence other than collective security? What is NATO other than collective security? What is the EU efforts at increased defense? Not very impressive so far, but it is cooperative security. I mean, NATO has an integrated air defense system. The French are talking about having their nuclear forces somehow covering more than just France. I'm not sure how realistic that is because it's a pretty small force, but it is a deterrent. Britain and France, you know, work well together. The Poles are, you know, an important military power. So, I mean, you know, this is military cooperation, but that's security. You have intelligence cooperation, which I think matters enormously. You have cooperation on law enforcement. But if by collective security you mean international law and treaties, then I think we're in more trouble because you see a steady degradation of that kind of multilateral cooperation that I have to say, to me at least, precedes the infamous Donald Trump. I mean, Trump is, you know, gets plenty of blame. But he is, you know, an American nationalist of, you know, a very recognizable sort. He's not an isolationist by any means. And in fact, when you look at you know, what's his administration has done as opposed to what he says, they've put more money into European security, more money into NATO, they've put troops into Poland and into the Baltics. They've actually made deterrence against a much more aggressive Russia real. And so, you know, that's okay, but you know, the INF treaty is disappearing, ground forces treaties are disappearing, you have a kind of social media war that nobody's controlling. I mean, the whole cyber field is entirely pretty much unregulated, particularly internationally. You have in the OSCE, as you said, which Russia's always had trouble with, right? I mean, Russia has been unhappy with the OSCE for a very long time, you know, thinking that it was biased against them. But to put a block in front of everything now is a bit depressing. So, you know, I see both halves. On military defense and security, I do see cooperation, which in a way is stronger in some ways, though the rhetoric may be nastier. But in terms of international agreements and international law and respect for international norms, that has degraded, there's no question.
I agree with you on collective security, what you said, there's NATO, cooperative security maybe, possibly splitting hairs, cooperative, collective, but cooperative security was what in the OSCE Charter, or the KSCE Charter at the time, was the security in Europe is undivided. So it's all, you know, it's one Europe and it's beyond the EU. And bigger countries, of course, the US, but Russia especially, if they do not get anything out of this cooperative security, then they just opt out. They have other possibilities, and you see this. And therefore, the question, it will cost us money to do the deterrence which one possibly needs. And this means we do have a adversary, possibly Russia. But is that the case? Do we need more weapons? Do we need more money to have this cooperative security? And this could be a naive question, of course. It's so easy to say the 2.0%. This is something which the US administration is very serious about, and Germany is failing quite a bit. But that will cost a lot of money. And as far as I understand, new security, cyber, etc., it's not that expensive. So how do we work with this cooperative security in times where we have to rethink security? It's not the Cold War.
No, it's not the Cold War, but it's also not the warm peace. And people can argue about this. I mean, you have Emmanuel Macron, France, trying to reach out to Russia. You know, not many people are supporting him, I have to say. But you know, the standard NATO policy, for instance, is deterrence and dialogue, right? That you're ready to defend, you know, and you have to prove that you're ready, because that's the nature of deterrence. Because if you actually fight, that's a failure. I mean, that means deterrence fails, right? So to me, deterrence is actually a form of peace guarantee. It's not a purely military exercise. I mean, it's designed to stop aggression, not to start wars. And I think people don't really grasp that anymore. I mean, that defense spending is not a necessarily warlike thing. And if you don't spend sufficiently, you can make yourself vulnerable. Now, again, one can argue about the balance, and balance is truly important. And I do think this 2% of GDP goal was always an abstract idea. I mean, the idea was to get Europe to spend more. But at the same time, it is worth recognizing that, you know, this Russia, which to some degree is an older Russia, a pre-communist Russia in some ways, but it's also partly our failure, I think, to pull Russia in to the West in a sufficient way when communism fell. Now, I've talked to a lot of diplomats, and you may be among them, who tried. I mean, it's not like people didn't, you know, open their arms to Russia, but it wasn't always done very well, and sometimes it was done in a rather patronizing fashion, or as the Russians would say, some sort of triumphalist fashion. And to some degree, the reaction, this is an analogy that may strike you as odd, but I often think of Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union the way I think of Germany after 1918, when, you know, German troops were still on foreign soil when the war ended, and what was considered a defeat was a shock to many Germans, or a surprise, and needed to be explained somehow. And there was a feeling that at Versailles, you know, the Western allies took advantage of German weakness to impose far too strict conditions upon it. And that led to quite a lot of, you know, German revisionism. Well, it's not so different from the mood in Russia. Russia does feel, Putin certainly feels, that the West helped bring down the Soviet Union, that it was complicit in doing so, that it took advantage of Russia when it was weak, of Yeltsin when he was drunk, and parts of Russia that have traditionally been Russian, you know, Belarus, Ukraine, whatever, were somehow unfairly ripped away. So they're kind of the Sudetenland of this Russia. So, you know, that we can't control, but that has led to a very aggressive Russian that has turned its back on cooperation, really, with the West, except in certain key matters, right? And it's a Russia that is trying to exercise more power in Belarus, in Ukraine, in the stands, and which is feeling very vulnerable on both sides, both from a strong Europe, which still is, a more involved America, and a China, which is rising, which for the moment, has a kind of relationship with Russia. But I think most Russians feel that, they're being treated by the Chinese as aide de camp or with a degree of contempt. So, I worry about Russia. I think a happy Russia, prosperous Russia is a safer Russia, but that's not the Russia that we have. So, we need to keep our guard up, keep our arms open, ready for change if it happens. But cooperation of this kind takes two to tango, I'm afraid.
I agree with you, and you have lived in Russia. I think we lived there actually together and worked.
Yeah.
There's and I completely agree with you. The Russians they also would agree with you, saying what happened in 1918, in 1919 in Germany. This is what happened in the Soviet Union and in Russia in 89, 90, 91. They would also argue we don't want to change the security system in general. We like the UN. We don't really mind the OSCE, and in this turmoil, what we see at the OSCE, as a matter of fact, Russia had, at least that's how it looks like, nothing to do. These were other countries who are not very happy how the OSCE works and what's the essence of the OSCE. The question is how much security can we have in Europe with an ongoing conflict in Ukraine and a Russia which has a different narrative? We like to speak about narratives, which says we gave you, the US, our hand with President Reagan. We ended the Cold War together. That's, as you know, that's the understanding. And now there is no cooperation whatsoever. And whatever we do is a response to what you do. I don't want to go into detail into this, and I'm sure you all know this. And that's what I pointed to Brandt. He had a different objective. It was about German reunification again, coming together. But is there anything in common positive agenda for European security which we can see? Or is it what we have? Most countries are okay with the status quo. Clearly, this is not for Ukraine. But in general, it seems to be everybody's okay. The US is saying, yes, it's important for us, but we have other priorities. Is it good enough to have what we have? And that's what I'm...
Yeah. Well, I personally don't think it is. I mean, the fact that nothing terribly terrible has happened yet doesn't mean that it won't. You do have internal processes in a lot of countries, a rise of more nationalist politics, which is Eurosceptic, it's not happy. You have a kind of, populist is a word I don't like, because a German populist is not at all the same as an Italian populist, right? I mean, they're entirely different. But you have people inside who are challenging this assumption, the status quo, the assumption that, we're better together than apart. You have people saying, this is fine, but it's too big, it's uncontrollable. We're paying for, poorest and least motivated among us. You've heard all that. And then you have with Turkey, again, it could change, but under Erdogan, you have a very different Turkey. A very aggressive Turkey, which is pushing for a sort of very Muslim, neo-Ottoman reach, which isn't always on Russia's side. Obviously, in Libya and in Syria, Turkey is opposed in principle to Russian foreign policy aims. But at the same time, Turkey is not subduing its national interests to the collective, whether it's in the EU or it's in NATO. And NATO, both are consensus organizations, to be sure. NATO works reasonably well, but when a country starts blocking collective security to promote its own national interests, which is what Turkey does inside NATO, it creates all kinds of problems, let alone playing with Russia. And then, it creates issues in the Eastern Mediterranean, with Greece. There's a whole debate over gas and oil. So you see elements of fission, which are always there. Some people used to argue the superpower war, rivalry kept Europe quiet, right? Because the sort of nuclear confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union was a way of keeping, Europe quiet on side, because the risk of that war was real, and probably a lot of it would have been fought on European soil and German soil. So, but at the same time, it just seems to me Europe talks. I mean, Europe is a collective, right? Let's say Macron or Joseph Borrell. They talk about Europe as having its own security interests. They talk about strategic autonomy, whatever that means. They talk about a Europe that can defend itself, a Europe that shouldn't have to depend any longer on the United States. But right now, all that seems to me very hollow. I mean, for Europe really to take over its own defense would require a defense spending that no Europeans want to do. It would be 4 or 5% of GDP every year, and that's a lot. And so I think partly it's, I understand the frustration, particularly in the period where Trump and Putin and Xi Jinping and Erdogan are all around Europe creating problems. I understand the frustration, but it's really, what does Europe want? And what's it prepared to spend to get it? And those questions are not clear to me.
It is not clear to me either. I think the EU, under the presidency of Germany at the moment, has it on its agenda, but the EU is not very united on that matter at all.
And either is Germany.
Absolutely, I agree with you. But coming back to the overall picture, William Burns, the former Undersecretary of State, you know him, and the head of Carnegie, wrote about a new US foreign policy, and I'm coming back to that later. But what he said in general, and this also goes for the EU and Germany, so you have to manage ambition with weakness. Nothing new. I think Kissinger talked about that. And the question is for you, is this just a hollow word, or is there something to it? Because the 1990 moment was, we can do whatever we want. And the we is the West, the EU and the United States. But that seems to be over. So we cannot think in those, with those ideas anymore. So what would you make out of this, looking for ambition on the one hand side and weaknesses? What does that mean, for example, for Europe, because you live in Europe, but also for the US?
Well, these are complicated questions, and let's say no. Well, no.
You're the one who could answer it.
No, they're excellent. But let's say Joe Biden wins in November, right? Not a bad assumption, but maybe he won't win. But I think the outcome of this election will have a lot to say as a partial answer to those questions, right? Because Biden is an old-fashioned Democrat. He's, in favor of multilateralism. He'd rejoin the Paris climate thing. He'd rejoin the WHO. I think the US would start paying money into UNRWA again. I mean, it would be a different actor in the world. But, the river keeps flowing. The world changes. China's rising. And, it's not a superpower world anymore. It's not a unipolar world, which which the Americans had and squandered, it seemed to me. And Europe is afraid of a G2 world, which is US-China. Right? I mean, that's the fear. Russia, you can kind of contain. I mean, it's a regional, I mean, Putin hated it when Obama called him just a regional power, right? But that's what they are. They're a nuclear regional power, but a regional power. China, you know, there's a lot to play for there. You know, we don't know a lot about what goes on inside China, actually. It is probably weaker than it looks from the outside. Part of Xi Jinping's control over the society that he's exercising is not just because he likes to control the society, but he's afraid of what happens if he doesn't, right? So, you know, there are all kinds of issues going on, but there's no question China under Xi wants to be an equal to the United States by 2050. It built more ships in the last 2 years than the size of the entire British Royal Navy. It built 80 ships. It's developing its previously rather small nuclear capability. It's building, you know, very sophisticated missiles that are designed to hit American aircraft carriers. I mean, it does exercises aimed at Taiwan. We see it exercising control over Hong Kong. And none of us are going to go to war for Hong Kong. And it's not clear anyone's going to go to war for Taiwan either. But Europe doesn't want to be torn, right? But I mean, that's the point, really. I mean, Germany does huge business with China. Now, it's more nervous sometimes about intellectual property theft and fairness and transparency and openness of markets, but still, there's a huge, huge market for export-driven Germany. And everybody wants to trade with China. The question is, at what price? The Americans would say, oh, you have to decouple. And to some degree, the Chinese say, well, we're decoupling, you know, we have our own Amazon and we have our own internet and we have our own Facebook and we control all of that. They have a very good firewall, but China needs the world too. But so I don't expect Europe to sit in America's lap on this issue, even if it's a Biden president, but there's going to be strain. And the question is, you know, part of international cooperation, I'm going on too long, but I believe that the World Trade Organization is important. I believe it matters. I believe Europe should work with the United States to reform the appellate court system and get it working again. I believe the US should try to go back into TTIP, this sort of multilateral trade organization. And I believe the US and Europe should have a serious discussion, not an ideological one, to try to come up with a strategy to deal with a rising China. And that's not happening.
Okay, and I understand. And this is something which Burns calls not a weakness, maybe, but something where even the US has to cooperate with its allies. If we come back shortly to Russia, Tom Graham, you know him, the former advisor to Bush, and
he was in Moscow when we were
yes.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, correct. And Matt Wojcicki, who heads the Kennedy Institute in Washington, they wrote recently an article saying it's not enough to have an attitude towards Russia, you need a policy. Russia is not changing its postal address, it will be there. And here it's clear that part of the EU is in between and some are rather here or on the other side, which makes it difficult. Nord Stream is something which I'm sure you have possibly even written about, which worries parts of the EU, not all of them. And this is the one hand side. What I mean, where can we come together to have an understanding that we have to work together? It's not about appeasing anybody, but it's all, we don't have the measurement or not the measures anymore to do what we possibly did in the 90s. we cannot change these countries. We can deter, but also, you know, the old Hamel report from, what was it, 67, to have a debate on this.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're saying there needs to be a good, serious, open discussion between the US and the EU on these matters. Is that something?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And it shouldn't all just be open. I mean, probably a lot of it ought to be private.
Yeah. Open in terms of, you know, we argue, that's what I meant. Not on
of course. No, of course. But I mean, but one must also look at Russia with clear eyes. I mean, one should listen to what they say, right? I mean, not dream that they're doing or saying things they're not saying and doing. And I think there's always been a kind of wish in Europe that, you know, Russia could somehow, you know, be a friend. Well, Russia doesn't feel like, to me, it wants particularly to be a friend. It sees NATO and Europe as a threat, not as a friend, a threat to its social cohesion. Now, obviously, it needs technology and all the rest of it. But, you know, if you listen to Putin, I mean, he attacks Europe for its liberalism, for its sexual freedom, for its gender equality, for its respect for gay and lesbian rights, right? I mean, for its secularism. I mean, this is a cultural conflict. I mean, this is a part of Russian nationalism that's been there. It's being instrumentalized, and it's being instrumentalized as a weapon in parts of Europe. In Slovakia, in the Czech Republic, in Poland, in Serbia, right? I mean, this appeal to orthodoxy, but also this appeal to the religious identity, which the so-called gender-bending, liberal Brussels elite is turning us all into whatever it's turning us into, right? And it's powerful. And then you have this very impressive social media system in local languages. I'm not talking about RT or even Sputnik, which are Russian-owned, Kremlin-owned social media and internet news sites. But, Russian support for weird stuff, I have to say, in a lot of these local languages, and nobody knows quite what to do about it.
Yeah, Steven, exactly. That's what you say is what's happening. It's the status quo. I agree with you. The thing is, it's not getting better. There are no possible policies which we had in the 90s. Russia is strong. It feels strong. It gives the impression of being strong. Yes, we know the economy is possibly not according to standards, but still. So how does it fit into cooperative security? You would argue, how can it be cooperative with Russia? I agree, but just a sec. There is no understanding at least in Germany anymore. I don't know if it was ever there, even though we are blamed for this, to look for friends. This is not anything with friendship. There is no partnership, but it will cost us to always go on. We have not Germany alone, but NATO has its troops in the Baltic countries. Possibly, Poland is looking for more. This costs money, and it goes on and on and on. That's what I meant. So, understanding all what you said, still one needs something beyond deterrence, because this is not solving it. And
I agree with that. I mean, and also I understand. Russians do see this as aggressive. They see NATO troops, American troops, moving to their borders, which NATO was very reluctant to do before 2014 and the seizure of Crimea. But that's what's driven all of this, right? Suddenly the Russians did something that no one ever expected them to do. Play around in Ukraine, fine. Putin's paranoid about color revolutions, fine. They meddle in Ukraine. This is their Mali Brati, right? But to actually break, Helsinki Accords, to break boundaries, to annex something by force, that changed things. And Georgia, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, that was an indication. You see in Syria, new Russian weapons. I'm not saying Russia's, an enemy. It's not. But I'm just asking, what can we give Russia that it actually seems to want to promote this kind of cooperation? I mean, maybe it is true that the West should have its arms open more. It is true. And I do think the West needs to keep faith with Democrats inside Russia, which is very important. But I do fear Russia's regression, for whatever reason, makes it very, very difficult to have, the kind of post-Helsinki understandings that we used to have. Now, I'm hoping, on a very key issue of nuclear weapons control, there's only one treaty left, New START. It's very easy to renew. It can be restructured. I don't think the Chinese are going to come into it, but I don't think there's anything wrong with asking them to join. But I'm very hopeful that, the US doesn't pull out of it. Russia wants to keep it for very good reasons. And I would think a Biden presidency would also want to renew it. But the INF, Russia violated the INF, it was useless, right? What's in Kaliningrad is mobile, it violates the treaty. You don't know whether there's a conventional warhead on it or a nuclear warhead. It's designed to be dual use. And, it's how do you deter that?
Yes, I think, but deterrence, NATO is powerful. It puts way more money into security, defense, and so on and so forth. Now, Russia, the figures.
Much.
China has more. Again, see, this is what I'm pressing a little bit on here. And again, you're not a prophet, me neither. But here, usually politicians and activists stop because they say they're talking about the status quo. It's bad. The question is, how do we go beyond?
Yes.
And apologies for, and again, you're not a politician, but you're so experienced. You have seen so many events and you talk to so many people. That's why it's interesting for the viewers.
Well, this is part of, unfortunately, why I sometimes have a darker view than some people. I'm sorry.
But again, this is a little bit towards prophecy, but still, would you say that what we have in place at the moment, security-wise, we have NATO, we still have the Paris Charter. As a matter of fact, nobody has said that they want to throw it in the dustbin. Do you think this is enough, or is it time to go beyond what we have? I can't remember who said this, saying, the Paris Charter and all that was good for good times, but it's not good for bad times. So do we have to look for something for bad times?
Well, no, I actually think the enhancement of deterrence, which has happened with these small battalion groups, is sufficient right now. It's enough. The message has been provided and heard. I don't think we need a lot more military buildup, despite what Trump says. But when you look at the European neighborhood, you look at North Africa, you look at Mali, where the French are pretty much alone, right? The Germans have helped as best they can. The Americans say it's your problem, but this stems from our failure in Libya, right? Our failure to create some sort of functioning government after the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. We have a migration problem in Syria, which I'm deeply ashamed about just as a person. I mean, we said after Srebrenica, we said after Rwanda, we said after Pol Pot, never again, never again. Well, it's happening in front of our eyes. I mean, most people think nearly 600,000 Syrians are dead, right? Are dead. Half the country is displaced or is refugees. You have this proxy war going on. Where has Europe been, right? I mean, this is the problem. in Libya, where is the EU? This effort to block arms smuggling is not working. I mean, there's a frustration. So, I mean, Europe can do more in this smaller way, I think, to defend its own interests and to help its own neighborhood. I mean, and I think Europe, again, what is collective Europe? But Europe needs to understand that it can use hard power as well as the soft power of money and friendship. And the two together work better.
I agree. I would argue, and you know this, there is still the long shadow of the Second World War, especially for Germany. You can be annoyed at it, but it's just...
No, I don't. I'm not annoyed at it. I mean, but it's not just a German issue, right? I mean, there are lots of other countries in Europe. I mean, Germany is, this will sound terrible to you, but I've lived in Germany and I actually admire Germany. And sometimes I joke, I say, I trust Germany more than Germans trust Germany.
Good point. Good point.
No, I do. I mean, you can handle AfD, you can handle these strains and struggles. You've created a really incredibly successful functioning democracy. I mean, it's impressive. And I don't want it to be turned into something else. Right?
Yes, and Germans are wondering exactly what that. Stephen,
yeah.
I would like to end, if you don't mind, because I'm sure the viewers would
Please.
like to hear something about that too. I heard that the other day and I like it, and that's the final question. Do you think, and hopefully you're not too angry at that question, because it might be too big, do you think that the United States, in what is happening at the moment of this amazing polarization we have in the US, we have this in Europe too, no doubt, but it seems to be in the US, it is especially very clear. Do you think the US is having its 1989 moment right now, where things do change and it's unclear where it goes? It could be, as your president says, beautiful, but it can also be extremely difficult. Steve, what do you think?
Well, I look at my own country obviously from a distance, but I feel very American and I follow it and I have a lot of friends and so on. And I'm, this partisanship has been growing for a long time. The two-party system worked for a while as a kind of complacent elitism. Gore Vidal used to joke that America was really a one-party system, right? And that sometimes you had Republicans and sometimes you had Democrats. But now you have really vicious fights between a Republican Party that's pretty much white and religious and a Democratic Party that is pretty much minority, right? That's urban. And so you really have an incredible division, and the country is very split. It's been split for years, but it's increasingly split. What's happened is it's gotten nastier and nastier and nastier. And what worries me is this will go on through the election, that the election will be very close, it could be contested, could be court cases, you could have delays. We're one of the rare countries that after you have an election, we still have 2 months to go before we change administrations. This was built into the Constitution when you had to ride a horse, right? But you don't have to ride a horse anymore. But still there's that interim period that makes everybody nervous, right? Because Trump is a man who claimed the election he won was rigged. So what's he going to say about an election that he might lose? And what's his base going to say? Which is already angry. Just to see the polarization of mask wearing during this virus, it's been deeply, deeply depressing to me. So, the United States basically, it still has an enormous sense of the world. It still plays a very important role. I mean, one shouldn't confuse the White House with, American foreign policy generally, or even what Pompeo says, with what's really always going on. However, we have lost authority. I think we've lost reputation. I think we've lost weight in the world. We've lost influence in the world, which is one reason you have all these other people rising up and misbehaving because of perceived American disinterest. and you have a kind of very ugly America First feeling about American policy. Now, some of that will change. Certainly the atmospherics will change, the makeup will be different. But on China, for instance, pretty bipartisan sense that America's future will be defined by its rivalry and its deterrence of China. And Europe has to think through that very, very carefully. So I do get nervous. You also have a whole new generation that's angrier, that's noisier, which is encouraging. I think people should understand the world doesn't have to be the way it is. It can change. One reason I became a journalist was because you look at the world and you think this is not good enough, right? At least, as Marx said, to change the world, you first have to understand it. So that's kind of where we are. But America has lost a lot. And, it will be very difficult to regain in the same way, it seems to me.
So it is a little bit more than the usual. That's why I asked about the 1989 moment. It's more than that, because population has changed, the world has changed, and people are looking differently now from the US towards Europe.
Yeah, no, it's true, because basically, America isn't anymore dominated by descendants of migrants from Europe. It's just not true anymore. And to some degree, the Republicans are fighting this rear guard defensive action, right, against this new America, which is different, which is younger, more Hispanic, more Black, more young. It's just different. Still creates amazing technology. It has great universities. It still basically keeps to individual freedoms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it is a country that is very much more likely to be looking at China, to be looking at Latin America, to be looking at Asia, than to worry too much about what's going on in Europe. And this may remind you of the period between the wars, between the two world wars. So Europe should, be a little more capable of taking care of itself.
Thank you, Steven. And thank you very much for a very inspiring talk. Cooperative security is a difficult topic. It is something where the EU always looks at, but as you said, Steven, the EU has to do more, which is not that easy if you're not as united as you would like to have it. Thank you very much, Steven. Thank you very much for watching us, and have a wonderful summer vacation, all of you. Steven, you too.
Thank you. Gleichfalls. Bye-bye.